Now, just for reference, as we get into Isaiah 56, it seems to be somewhat of a continuation of his message in Isaiah 55, where Isaiah gives a covenant appeal extending beyond just Israel to the ends of the earth, to Gentile nations, and even to adversarial nations, appealing for their salvation. And so in that context of having extended a covenant invitation to Gentile nations beyond the borders of Israel, we come to Isaiah 56. It definitely seems related, if not a continuous message, but definitely related. And once we get down to verses 9 and onward, that is really seen as part of 57, part of a continuous message that extends into chapter 57. So we'll come to that in a moment. But just to start with verse 1, thus says the Lord, keep justice and do righteousness. God instructs Israel in these opening verses to act justly, which involves prioritizing heaven's standards of justice and righteousness. God instructs Israel to prepare itself for compliance with his messianic kingdom, when his standards will be openly revealed and enforced in a much greater measure. So keep justice, do righteousness, for soon my salvation will come and my righteousness will be revealed, which is really a day of accountability, where we really have got to convert to compliance with God's standards, because his Messiah will be judging openly and accountability will be much more immediate. Blessed is the man who does this. And what's so cool about verse 2, one of the things I love about verse 2, is God proclaims a blessing for those who adhere to his covenant. Those covenant loyalists, those who understand the biblical narrative and seek to live by it, orient their lives around it, receive a blessing. Understanding the biblical narrative of God's kingdom is an essential step to receiving this blessing, which is what we're endeavoring to do right here, right now. So let's get up into verses 3 through 5 and 6 and 7 and 8. These are our very similar messages about Gentiles being included in God's covenant promises. Really 3 through 8, all the way down, God welcomes Gentiles and former servants of false gods into the heritage of covenant loyalty. As we look at verse 3, let not the foreigner who's joined himself to the Lord say, the Lord will surely separate me from his people. Or the eunuch say, behold, I'm a dry tree. Now this issue of the eunuchs were physically castrated, usually in the service of foreign kings or false gods. Since eunuchs cannot inherit promises of generational legacy, God actually promises that their names will be remembered on a monument within Messianic Jerusalem in the Messianic age. I will give in my house and within my walls a monument and a name that will be better than sons and daughters. I will give them an everlasting name that will not be cut off. A huge promise given to who were formerly servants of false gods and other kings, but who commit themselves to the Lord. You can sense the overwhelming generosity of this promise, and it's really an extension of God's heart for anybody who would turn to him, no matter what their background is. And then we get to verse 6, the foreigners who join themselves to the Lord to minister to him. And this subject of ministry to the Lord is really near and dear to my heart, but expanding on that would be an entirely other class, so I'll come back to that another time. But to love the name of the Lord and to be his servants, everyone who keeps the Sabbath and does not profane it and holds fast to my covenant, these I will bring to my holy mountain and make them joyful in my house of prayer. Now, interestingly, God welcomes covenant loyalists from among the Gentiles to worship in Jerusalem. Now, there was already historical precedence for this. Accommodations were already available in Isaiah's day, dating all the way back to Solomon, for Gentiles to worship in Jerusalem. But Gentiles were not considered as equal recipients in God's covenant. Isaiah made it clear, though, that God intends to extend the boundaries of his covenant to every nation, tribe, and tongue. We looked at some of that from last week. But while the early church was adjusting to the spiritual inclusion of Gentiles, the Messianic age will involve further tangible inclusion of Gentiles, extending to entire nations in the Messiah's reign. It really seems like Isaiah's promise here reads almost like a direct reflection of Solomon's prayer at the dedication of the temple in 1 Kings chapter 8. And I've included this reference in the notes. I'll just read it to you here briefly, where Solomon is dedicating the temple. This is in his dedication prayer. Likewise, when a foreigner who is not of your people comes from a far country for your name's sake, when he comes and prays toward this house, would you hear from heaven, your dwelling place, and do according to all which the foreigner calls to you, in order that all the peoples of the earth may know your name and fear you, as do your people Israel. Solomon even had, I think, a real prophetic understanding of God's desire to include the nations in this reality from the first days of the temple being constructed. That's pretty remarkable. And to see that extended, hundreds of years now to Isaiah's day in these promises, and then extending hundreds of years, even thousands of years later to today, it's really cool to see the continuity of all of this. Now for verse 8, Isaiah had provided many hopeful promises of Israel's ultimate regathering in the Messianic age, which we see in Isaiah 35 and 41 and 49 through 51, all of these descriptions of God's heart to regather the outcast of Israel. But that is not all. As if that was not enough, Isaiah extends these regathering promises to covenant loyalties from among Gentile nations who will assemble for worship in the Messianic age. I will gather yet others besides those already gathered, besides the people from among Israel. Another great cross-reference for this comes from Psalm 47, verse 9. The princes of the peoples will gather as the people of the God of Abraham, for the shields of the earth, the allegiance of the nations belongs to God. He is highly exalted. Oh, it's so awesome. Awesome promises. There's a couple other references there for you to look at in the notes, but let's move on now to 9 through 12, and really what extends now into chapter 57. So we get into verse 9, all you beasts of the field come and devour. Though interpretations vary on the language of this verse and exactly how we interpret it, Isaiah seems to be signaling predator nations, personified as beasts, coming to consume Israel in its vulnerable state. And I think other cross-references with Isaiah himself will really verify that. This consumption may appear indirect initially, as Israel's assets and workforce are gradually depleted during that final rebellion period, but it will escalate to overt, complete destruction during the final tribulation, where that consumption turns from like a soft consumption to a very hard consumption, like we genuinely want to destroy the nation of Israel, which we've looked at in previous weeks. So these beasts of the field most likely are those adversarial nations being summoned to punish and discipline Israel during the tribulation. And here is God's justification confronting the wickedness in Israel's leadership. His watchmen are blind. Those watchmen usually represent the spiritual leaders, those who are supposed to have prophetic insight, whether they're of the priesthood or those who've been given authority or responsibility to care for and be watchful for the people of Israel, like shepherds of the sheep, the population. His watchmen are blind. They're without knowledge. They're all silent dogs. They cannot bark. They're completely distracted. Something else has really captivated their attention. They're not even paying attention to the danger of these beasts coming. They're dreaming, lying down, loving to slumber. There's this laziness. The dogs again are the watchmen. The dogs have a mighty appetite, and they never have enough. They're so busy eating their own food, chasing selfish ambition. They're not paying attention at all because they're constantly pursuing that selfish ambition and just never ever having enough. But they are shepherds who have no understanding. They have all turned to their own way, each one to his own gain, one and all. Come, they say, let me get wine, let us fill ourselves with strong drink. Tomorrow will be just like this day, great beyond measure. Of course, they're delusional. They've really, really lost touch with the situation. The selfish ambition and blindness of Israel's watchmen in that day permits this soft consumption of the Jewish resources and people. And probably as they accept a promise of a very hefty profit share. There's very likely some bribery going on here, and really this gets expanded on in even greater detail as we get into chapter 57, but even more in chapter 59, which we're going to look at in just a moment. So let's stop there for 56, and then we will continue on in chapter 57.